Pollster More in Common have done an excellent job of gauging the nation's opinion on all manner of issues, from Israel-Palestine to what voters' favourite kind of cheese is. Last week, they came up with a very interesting poll, asking respondents who answered yes to the question, Britain is on the wrong track, to state what they thought the main reason was that Britain had been put onto the wrong track. By far the most chosen answer was the 2016 Brexit referendum, followed by the coronavirus pandemic and then the election of Tony Blair in 1997. Only a combined 13% of respondents identified either the election of Margaret Thatcher or the 2008 financial crisis, however, and the coalition government did not feature at all in any of these polls, which is crazy to me. It's crazy to me that the coalition government doesn't feature in this particular poll here, because when you look at so much of these, you see so much cause and effect, right? You see so much cause and effect. And of course, there's always going to be recency bias in these polls. There's always going to be recency bias. So, but that notwithstanding, what led to Brexit? What was the reason that Brexit happened? Now, obviously, there were plenty of people who had very specific viewpoints on the European Union that were negatively polarised already. But to be able to have the kind of victory to upend the status quo that led to Brexit, or the Brexit was a manifestation of, there needs to be some level of dissatisfaction that creates it. And all of those things that created a dissatisfied population was all of the stuff that you see elsewhere within that poll. You look at the 2008 financial crisis, which was used as the justification for austerity. So austerity was basically the brainchild of George Osborne because of a paper called Growth in a Time of Debt, written by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff coming up to 2010. And because the Labour government had run up a big budget deficit, engaging in counter-cyclical stimulus to kick the economy back into gear post-recession during the financial crisis, they said, well, look, our government debt as a percentage of GDP is over this specific level. It says in this paper, we have to cut spending. Now, of course, they wanted to do that anyway. But regardless, the kind of formula that had been created during the Labour government of previous was that there was a bit more money that was put from council block grants into poorer areas of the country. So that meant the social infrastructure that was necessary to keep people in at least good standing in terms of their standard of living had been kind of erased by the slashing of those council block grants, which were heavily targeted at the poorer areas of the country, right? So that, combined with the loss of jobs from deindustrialization, which was obviously a Blairite thing, because they were carrying on from a bunch of Thatcherite groupthink around how you do the economy. The deindustrialization was kind of born in the Thatcherite era, but continued by Blair, also led to the breakdown in levels of prosperity in the regions, in the post-industrial regions around the country. And it's those areas that voted for Brexit. So the financial crisis, which was helped by Thatcher, was what created austerity, which what created Brexit. So it seems incredibly short-sighted, again, recency bias notwithstanding, but we just forget that there is a material reason for all of these things happening. And again, for me personally, whilst I think that the actual single moment that was that really kind of broke apart the country was 2008, you can't really have the kind of effect on this country that 2008 had without the election of Thatcher in 1979. The freeing up of the financial sector, the fact that the financial sector became so much of our economy, that the bubble that was created by Thatcher's Big Bang was what led to us being overexposed to 2008, even though 2008 was an American phenomenon that had effects over here. And then because of that, that led to all of the different dominoes falling for Brexit to happen. And a lot of Remainers, I think, tend to put Brexit up on a pedestal as this single, unique ill. You know the kind of person. If you're watching at home, you know the kind of person who will say, well, actually, 2012 was great because we had the Olympics and everyone came together. I'm like, there were riots. There were riots on the street in 2011. People were burning down London, well, parts of London in 2011 because of the social unrest caused because of the social infrastructure being torn apart by austerity. So there was this material kind of gap in the kind of hardcore Remainers who view Brexit as a unique ill that they didn't understand because they weren't the people who were damaged. Their livelihoods weren't damaged by austerity or the financial crisis and were turbocharged by Thatcherite deregulation. So that's what I think in terms of the point of inflection on where this country started to go wrong. I think most socialists hold Thatcher as a unique ill. Kieran, where would you put this point of inflection?
Boringly, I completely agree with everything you said, Helena. I think recency bias shouldn't apply here because Brexit is in the poll and so on. And I think that austerity, I mean, you basically covered it all, right? But the failure so first of all, there's cutting of services. Yeah, of course, disastrous, absolutely disastrous. And even as an economic modality to try and stimulate growth in the short to medium term, it was a palpable failure because Britain had one of the most sluggish recoveries and is still extremely sluggish recovery. Okay, that's not entirely unique across the G20, but had one of the most sluggish recoveries in the G20 after the austerity politics of Osborne Cameron or Cameron Osborne. I think alongside that, the other cardinal sin was the failure when interest rates were basically at zero or actually at zero to borrow and to invest in the next generation of infrastructure. I mean, that is such a severe, that has left such a disastrous legacy for this country. And, where we are going forward and the amount of money that we would have to spend now in order to borrow similar amounts of money. Obviously, the debt repayments would be enormous. I don't personally I think that's arguing that is a false economy in the long run. But there is a point that by comparison to how we could have borrowed and spent 10 years ago, it poses more challenges and it's more problematic. So I think it was a massive instance of structural economic vandalism. And, it's quite easy to say this is all on one person. And it's also quite easy, once you do a little bit of learning, to be kind of contrarian about it and say, well, no, that's simplifying it. That's reductionist. It's not all on this one person. But actually, and society is obviously social phenomena, very complex, economic phenomena, sometimes very complex. In this case, actually, it's quite simple. George Osborne was massively instrumental individually in those decisions, those absolutely manifestly disastrous economic decisions. Individually, he was hugely instrumental. So I think you're right. I think obviously, Thatcherism laid the kind of groundwork for so much. I mean, you're right to point out financialization and the financial crisis. And you're right to point out the Big Bang, Thatcher's Big Bang, deregulation of the city in 1986. But I also think that, you pointed out it came from America. There's a boomerang thing here going on, Helena, with our first story, which is that actually, as you pointed out or alluded to, the financial crisis was essentially a crisis of financialization in housing. And it started in America with the subprime mortgage crisis and so on. But the financialization of housing, the big bang moment for that really was under Clinton in the late 1990s, which was essentially taking housing, deregulating, what you could do with housing and turning it into a bunch of very complex financial instruments that could then be traded in various ways on the financial markets. And exposing housing to that kind of chaos and instability really, really did lead us to 2008, 2009. And, obviously a big theme here in this episode, many of the things we're discussing is the instability in housing. And I think it's absolutely pertinent to mention that. But yeah, Osborne's austerity hugely supercharged Brexit, hugely supercharged many of the social problems we see today. And he deserves all the hate in the world.
I absolutely agree. I mean, my Twitter bio literally is called, I call myself the George Osborne hate account. I cannot put into words the absolute seething rage I have in my heart for George Osborne as a political figure. One of the single most damaging, because I think you could have fixed Thatcherism. I think that you can always renationalize things. Obviously, the oil sell-off was a really kind of big blunder in terms of the macroeconomy in this country. But I think you could theoretically have fixed it, but because they were at least running deficits in this period. But the George Osborne removal of money from the economy, this unique period where interest rates were zero, just being completely incinerated and thrown into the trash and never utilized, is unforgivable, absolutely unforgivable. Can you just bring up the graphic of the different party affiliations with how they look at where Britain went on the wrong track, which this is even more fascinating to me, even more fascinating, right? If you look, I think we've both kind of agreed here that the coalition government and Thatcher are so much to blame of this, right? But Thatcher very specifically insofar as the economy kind of changed in such a large way around her. The Green Party voters, they uniquely see Thatcher as more of a problem than everybody else, right? Everybody similar talks about Brexit on the kind of more liberal or left-wing end of the spectrum here. But the Greens, far more so than Labour voters, given that the Labour heartlands should be the post-industrial areas that were destroyed by Thatcher. But Green Party voters, no, they uniquely find Thatcher. And in fact, you look at the Liberal Democrat voters here on this particular graphic, and you see that they blame Thatcher even less than Tories do, which is hilarious to me, really. It just shows you the kind of people who vote Liberal Democrat, given that Lib Dems are actually some of the richest voters in the country statistically, because there's not like this kind of working class Tory types that you get, whereas Lib Dem voters are kind of uniquely in the kind of upper echelons of the income spectrum. And what's also interesting here is just how much Tony Blair really angers people on the right of politics, specifically Reform UK voters you're seeing there, because they kind of have this unique idea of the constitutional change of Blair being a problem, like the Human Rights Act and adhering to a bunch of EU rules, which is why, of course, Brexit is so low. But I would be really interested to talk to the 13% of Reform UK voters who think that the Brexit referendum was a really bad moment in history. I mean, you're in the wrong party, mate. You're in the wrong party there. And just, again, the non-featuring of George Osborne and David Cameron on these figures here. I mean, they could be in none of the above, but the ones who say none of the above are more likely to be from the right, who'd be less likely to blame them. It's really is crazy figures, and the pandemic is, I don't think that really needs explaining here. Again, what do you make of these party breakdowns, Kieran? They're quite revealing over the ways in which I think that people kind of misapprehend where their party is, or their party that they support is, in relationship to how policy has been passed previously.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of time passes and people forget exactly where their party stood on particular things. And I think Cameron Osborne, that phenomenon is very interesting and very strange. I mean, I wonder whether most of the ire or the wrath towards Cameron Osborne gets kind of funneled into Brexit, by the people who really think that was the worst thing that they ever did. I think the Lib Dem, you're right to put up the Lib Dem versus Tory on Thatcher's legacy. It's very interesting. I think that what it speaks to is that the Tories have changed around the economy much more than the Lib Dems have in recent times. And I think that's probably a kind of realignment of the sort of the reform kind of Trump-esque protectionism that's come into vogue in some parts of the political right now. And obviously the kind of corollary, the flip side of that is you have to kill your idols, you have to kill your darlings. If your idols and your darlings were Reagan and Thatcher. And that's why we see, people like Farage doing this strange kind of, no, I didn't say that, about his steadfast, indomitable support of Thatcherism up until 6 months ago. And now suddenly he's a kind of economic nationalist, whatever that means in the reform guise. And I think that probably explains that. I think a lot of Tories are fundamentally unimaginative, and they look to Trump and they say America first means Britain first in economic terms. If it's translated to our aisles, that's what it means. And so I think some of them have started to kind of distance themselves from Thatcher's legacy for that reason. I can't be certain. I haven't spoken to people in this poll, but I suspect that's what's going on. Whereas the Lib Dems, they have Nick Clegg kind of embodied it pretty well. They have they believe that the political system is quite broken, obviously, because it doesn't benefit them. And they have some ideas about constitutionalism and so on, but fundamentally they like the liberalisation of the economy.
And that's the thing, right, is that the Lib Dems' unique obsession with Brexit and their inability to look at the broader macroeconomy, it really just belies how much that, despite them actually outside of the coalition, they've never had a majority government in their entire existence, right? They had a 5-year period, which they try to make you forget about, by the way. Whenever it's talked about in terms of the 14 years of Tories, you'll notice the Lib Dems will always say 9 years. They don't like you to mention the coalition government, do they? Because they've been totally kind of out of power, and yet they just get always what they want. They always get what they want in terms of the economy, and they just disagree on social issues when it comes to the Conservatives, or the kind of cosmopolitanism, I guess, of the European Union, which is, I guess, what they cling to. Obviously, think that there are some good things the EU does. It's a really good important diplomatic bloc. As a geopolitical bloc, it's important in a more multipolar world where you need to have allies. You need to show geopolitical strength, right? Having that large bloc together is a good thing. But of course, the kind of like high-earning professionals who were supportive of remaining in the European Union, who were Liberal Democrat voters, were completely unaffected by the perceived wage arbitrage that you would have gotten from remaining a member of the single market, right? Having to compete with workers from low-earning countries in Eastern Europe, for example. Now, again, I think these economic factors get kind of overstated, for example, but regardless, they were the people who've always had the best out of governments from the kind of Thatcher era to today. They just disagreed with some social policies or the internationalist policies. So the Liberal Democrats really are just pride flag Thatcherites at this point. And you see them now, like these kind of voters getting angry at Keir Starmer over not being pro-business enough and putting taxes on private schools. I'm like, yeah, that's why the Lib Dems didn't vote for the tax on private schools, because they cater to a very well-off and very affluent voter base, again, who can't see anything that is materially wrong with the country outside of how we look on the global stage with regards to our relationships with the European Union. Very, very, very telling data there in my mind.